Yeah.
And Legos.
And Legos. Yes, exactly.
And Legos. Well, my daughter's keeping me young and active, and we're just loving it. When I was younger, I was working. I traveled, 3, sometimes 4 weeks out of the month. When I got home, I was exhausted, and it's all kind of a blur. But with Grace, who is our little miracle, it's been really a wonderful experience.
Well, Greg, I must say you're one of my favorite people to follow on Facebook because every picture brings joy to my day. So thank you for posting such beautiful pictures of you and your family.
Well, my wife can take 99.9% of the credit of that. I just share the pictures and kind of brag about her.
You're doing your part. That's good.
Yeah, exactly. But I'll get in there when I need to and change a diaper and, do all the dad stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's good to see. Look at you.
Well, she loves animals, right? I see pictures of her out in the wilderness with you guys or out in nature.
Oh, she is an animal lover extraordinaire. She loves the dogs and the cats and the ponies and the horses. And she's definitely kind of a ranch girl. We live out in Montana on a big piece of property, and she loves going outside and loves the snow, and it's a lot of fun.
The perfect Gerber baby, right? Out living her best life.
Every day.
Wow, congratulations. You guys can kick me to the audience. It's almost showtime. And Greg, congratulations. I'm so happy for you with all the good fortune and that's happened recently. So, and congratulations again on the baby.
Oh, thank you, Felicia.
We're still adding, so we're at about 3,500 and rising. So let's give it until 7 or 7:01.
Yeah, till the thing actually starts.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, great. Well, should we bring Margaret up? Because that's my other girl.
Sure.
You will find her.
She's right there, row 3.
Yeah,
there she is.
I grabbed her.
Okay.
There she is.
Hey,
Margaret.
Greg, beautiful horse. And number
Thank
2,
you.
I remember when you came to our office to give that talk, and it stuck with me forever and ever and ever. So thank you for doing that. That must have not been easy, but really appreciated it.
That was one of the most, I think, memorable talks that we've ever had. People still come up to me who were there who I didn't even know were there and say, how's Greg doing? Like that.
It was spellbound.
It was amazing.
The rawest of conversations is by far the most memorable. Let's be honest.
Yeah.
Well,
so thank you.
I was glad to do it. It was definitely a raw time for me.
Yeah, that's actually one of the things that, it's an amazing, talking to you now, what a great thing the pardon was for you, coming off of, being in jail was one thing, but then coming out was, has its own issues.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's it's almost a surreal stigma that gets placed on people. It's surreal unless you're living it, and then with the benefit of hindsight, you kind of look back and try to make sense of it all.
Yeah. And let's just think of folks who haven't had your life and career going into the whole situation, right? That just seems like an impossibility to overcome.
Well, it's one thing I hope we can get into a little bit. I mean, we can go on for hours about the injustice of our justice system, but even the clemency process it's farcical. Yeah. I mean, it really is just an unjust system with an unjust process. And, I truly think that, my ability to advocate for myself and, my complex selling pedigree, help make it happen. But that doesn't mean that, there were thousands and thousands of deserving people that just either they didn't have the resources or the know-how to make it happen. And my heart aches for them.
Yeah, I bet. Well, being able to sell storage turns out comes in handy at this point.
Yes. Yeah. Well, it's selling the most complex organization there is. So.
Right. Hey guys,
Amazing. Yeah.
it's 7:01. If you guys want to kick us down to the
Yeah.
audience and get started.
Okay,
Good
that
luck,
sounds
guys.
good.
Thanks, Mark.
Great.
Have fun. Good
Bye,
luck.
Greg.
Great.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us.
Felicia.
Okay, we'll move them down.
And we're crossing
Yeah.
5,000. We're crossing 5,000 right now, so I think we can start anytime you guys are ready.
Okay, all right. Well, why don't I give an introduction now that we're done chattering, and we'll get right into it. I mean, this is, first of all, everybody, we are so fortunate because Greg hasn't spoken publicly, particularly, open to everybody in the public. And Greg, probably well over a decade now, yeah?
Yeah,
And so
that's conservative.
yes, so this is the first time. So this is going to be like a real amazing experience for everyone. And I can say that with confidence because as Margaret said earlier, it was the best talk we've ever had at Andreessen Horowitz. So just a quick background. So, it's funny because I first met Greg because, when I was a young CEO, Marc was very how to be a more competent CEO. And so, he was very good at kind of finding the kind of people had the best reputation at running organizations in the world and kind of helping me get introduced to them. And it was under that kind of guys that I met Greg, who really had the reputation at the time of being the best kind of upcoming, young CEOs in all of technology. And at the time, he was running a company called Brocade, which he had grown from about 40 people to a $24 billion market cap. And this is in the early 2000s when 24 billion really meant something, when that was a lot of money. He, in doing that, not only built a great company, but also invented a category known as storage area networking, which of course is a predecessor to kind of cloud storage. So all of you who use S3 and the like and so forth can kind of thank Greg for pioneering that field and really building the premier company in the space. But in 2005, Greg was, and I think the right word is kind of manipulated into resigning from Brocade, and we'll kind of get into how that happened because it was a pretty unusual circumstance. It's only one like it I've ever heard of. And then in 2006, Greg was indicted for securities fraud related to backdating of stock options. He was convicted in 2007 and sentenced to 21 months in prison in order to pay a $15 million fine. But in 2009, the US Court of Appeals overturned the conviction because of prosecutorial misconduct. And the misconduct was very interesting in that the prosecutors intimidated witnesses into lying on the stand in exchange for kind of better treatment for them. And those witnesses later admitted that they had lied. And so it was overturned, but they tried Greg a second time despite kind of that misconduct. And he was convicted and sentenced to 18 months in prison, which he served. And then on January 20th, this year, he was granted a full pardon by President Trump, which we're all very grateful for. And so with that as a backdrop, let's get into the story. And I think, Greg, it would probably be great to start with Brocade and sort of how you built it. Because one of the things, I mean, not only was it a great company, but one of the things that always struck me about the whole criminal process was, I watch a lot of crime shows and they always look for the motive. But not only did you not have a motive, you had kind of an anti-motive in that you didn't make any money off it and you had a tremendous amount to lose. So maybe you can talk about like who you were, how you built Brocade, and then we'll get into kind of what happened.
Sure. Interestingly enough, for me, Brocade was the pinnacle of my career. Just getting that job was the pinnacle of my career. up to that point, because I started out at an OEM system company called Convergent Technologies and worked my way up through the sales ranks. And I knew from a very early age that I wanted to be a technology CEO. And I looked at Convergent and I saw that the PC was going to win that battle and that proprietary workstations didn't have a future. And then I thought about what was the next big thing. And I found a company that was a leader in PC networking called Banyan Systems. And I traveled to the East Coast and I became a networking expert and ran their sales organization. And I knew I needed to, check the box in terms of managing a big P&L. So I moved to Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and ran a division of a company called NORAND in the wireless data collection space. And all of that groomed me for the point where I was ready to come back to Silicon Valley, and I felt like I was ready to run a company. And I wanted to be very thoughtful about it. And at the time it was right before the dot-com bubble burst, and there were a lot of companies that were getting started, and there were a lot of companies in various categories. And I really was deliberate about how I went about trying to find this opportunity. And I came across Brocade, and it just had all of the perfect hallmarks. It was bringing a networking model to storage. It was an OEM business. It was something that I understood, both technically and in terms of how to sell to large enterprise accounts. And the only trouble was getting the job. And it took me 27 interviews to finally get that job.
27 interviews. That
27 interviews. But the funny part is that their CEO criteria was a guy who had come up through the system business. He had started, or he or she had started in a startup, grew it into a multi-billion-dollar company. They had networking background, enterprise software experience. And I said to the chairman at the time, I said, this guy doesn't exist. What you need is a leader. You need somebody who knows how to build teams, how to win business. So I got the job, and just serendipitously, as often happens with industries that are in transition, the storage business was, relatively arcane. There was a one-to-one relationship between servers and storage. And I was a true believer in this notion of bringing a networking model to it to create these big data center platforms where you had, n number of servers that could connect to, huge storage repositories. And we ended up gaining 90+% market share, and we were quite successful. Really at the end of the day, it's very simple. The success is probably analogous to lots of successful companies out there. You've got a winning vision, you've got a winning team, you've got a winning strategy, and you execute aggressively and, hold yourself and the team accountable. And that's really what I attribute Brocade's success to.
Yeah, and it was amazing because that success and the success and the growth that you were having kind of led to some like adjustments in your processes that kind of ended up being really problematic down the line. And so maybe talk a little bit about like what that was like, how fast you were growing, and then how that got Larry Sensini to go, well, maybe you should be a committee of one, and that whole thing that kind of walked you into that trap.
Sure. I mean, I think that in many ways, my story is a cautionary tale for many young CEOs. I think at the time I was 35 years old. Yeah. I'd run a $60 million division of a private company. And I was smart enough to at least know what I knew and what I didn't know. And I tried to augment my skill set by bringing in expertise from the outside into the company. I knew that we were going to scale this thing into a big company, and I brought a fellow named Mike Bird in as the company's CFO. He was, well pedigreed, came from one of the big six at the time. I brought in, manufacturing expertise. My focus was really sales and marketing, and the core team was a technology team. But in any event, the whole issue of stock options, up until the point that it became an issue, 5 years after being a public company, really didn't occur to me. Mike brought the process with him from Maxim. We'd group employees into a bucket. If we hired, let's say it was the month of January and we hired 200 people, Mike would say, what's the low stock price in that month, and we'd grant it to everybody to just try to be fair. And I said to him, hey, can we do this? And he said, yeah, of course. We did it that way. It's not an issue. We did it that way at my prior company.
And your lawyers had reviewed the plan and your accountants had reviewed the plan?
Well, actually, where it got a little treacherous in retrospect is we were hiring so many employees that it required a meeting of the board to grant these stock options. And, trying to get my board together was like herding cats at the time. And I had brought on this fellow named Larry Sonsini, who was his name was on the building at Wilson, Sonsini, Goodrich, and Rosati, because it was recommended to me, hey, you should really try to get this guy on your board. He can, help you with governance, and he can help you with M&A, and he can help you set up infrastructure. So at one of the board meetings, I said, hey, we've got this problem, guys. We're hiring, 250 people a month, and we need to grant stock options. And the price was going up. And Larry said, well, why don't we just make you a committee of one, Greg? I said, can we do that? Oh, yeah, it's not an issue at all.
It doesn't even sound like English, committee one.
Yeah, exactly. So you've got the most prestigious, pedigreed Silicon Valley attorney recommending to the board that Greg Reyes should be a committee of one for the purposes of expediting the administrative stock option granting. And in many ways, that's the catastrophic mistake that came back and bit me in the rear end.
Yeah, amazing. And so you were kind of going about it, signing off on these grants that your team was. Kind of what happened?
What happened in the granting process, or what happened when the wheels came off the cart?
Yeah, what happened when the wheels came off the cart?
Well, it was the fall of 2004, and the company was really positioned to do some big things in 2005. And at about that time, I'd been approached by John Chambers, who was the CEO of Cisco at the time, who had floated the idea of combining the two companies because Cisco tried to enter the storage area networking space. We've done an excellent job of maintaining market share and competing with them. And, I was excited. I was excited about what was happening at Brocade. I was excited about the prospects of being part of Cisco. And I get a call at our sales meeting in November. And I remember it vividly because we had Joe Montana and Harris Barton and Ronnie Lott, who were friends of mine, speaking at the kickoff meeting. And I get a call from Sonsini saying, hey, there's an issue having to do with stock options and the way that they were granted. And, the audit committee would like you to meet with their outside counsel. And I said, should I go, Larry, by myself? What's this all about? And he said, well, there's an issue. A disgruntled employee had said that his stock options had been backdated, and the audit committee, with Sarbanes-Oxley, wants to make sure that, this is a well-run investigation. Nothing's going to come of it. You don't need an attorney. So I went and met with them. It was like at the end of the sales meeting at 8:00 on a Thursday night. And I meet with these two guys from Morrison and Forrester without a lawyer, based on the advice of Sonsini. And the things that I said during that conversation were basically used to criminally prosecute me. And I'll footnote it by saying the things that I said were used to criminally prosecute me, even though the notes weren't written up until a week before my criminal trial, if you can believe that.
Wow. So that's another good lesson, which is, if you're going to meet with outside auditors on something like that, you do need an attorney. clearly.
Oh,
Wow, amazing.
100%, 100%. I mean, also don't have your corporate attorney sit on your board. I mean, there are so many lessons in retrospect that, now you kind of say like, well, that was stupid, Greg. But at the time, it was like, wow, you got Larry Sonsini on your board. And when he's advising you, you think that you've got a real luminary there. You're sitting at the knee of the Silicon Valley legal god.
Yeah, it's almost like a gold sticker of governance. It's, okay, here's the guy who's the authority on it, and he's on the board. Obviously, we're in good shape.
Yeah, I mean, little did I know.
Yeah.
In retrospect, he was setting me up.
Yes, and we need to get into that because that is one of the wildest parts of this whole wild tale. But so continue. So you had the meeting with the outside auditors. They didn't write up the notes for however long, but then what happened after that?
Well, then we're proceeding with the Cisco due diligence. Now imagine this: your number one competitor is doing due diligence. You're kind of opening the kimono, if you will. There's this audit committee-led investigation, and that the entire management team is recused from. I'm recused from. Other members of the board are recused from it, and this kind of drags on. And I can't remember if it was I think it was late December 2004. I get called into this board meeting that was happening at Wilson Sonsini's office. And Sonsini and another board member asked to meet with me privately.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, for the good of the company, Greg, you need to resign. And I said, well, what did I do? And they said, well, it's really inconclusive. There were no findings, but, we really think that for the good of the company that you need to resign. And, I was a company guy. I love the company that I built, and I resigned.
And there were a couple of nuances to that I think are important. One was in the Cisco acquisition deal, they wanted you to run their enterprise division, correct?
That's correct. I was the key guy.
So without you, that deal was definitely in jeopardy.
Without me, I believe that deal was going to be scuttled, which it was. But I didn't understand the wheels within wheels at the time that
were operating. And then the other thing that I recall was they claimed, this board member and Larry Sonsini, that KPMG would not certify your financials if you were the CEO. Is that right?
That's correct. That's what they told me.
Yes.
And that, in fact, really gave me no choice, because if we couldn't have audited financials, it was bad for the company, bad for the shareholders. As it turns out, that was a lie, and it was a lie proffered by Sonsini to trick me.
And how did
you
find it? How'd you find out it was a lie?
I found out through discovery after the fact.
Yeah, in legal discovery as part of the criminal trial. Yes.
Correct.
Yeah, that's amazing. So that whole thing was just fabricated.
It was fabricated to get me to resign. Now, of course, the optics of it are, wow, this guy must be a really bad guy. He resigned. Why else would he resign? He loved the company. He was the company in many ways. He was at least the face of the company.
Yeah. So it looked bad. It fouled the M&A transaction, which probably would have ended the whole thing, because Brocade would have gone away as a standalone company, and it was all based on this weird false premise. So why you? Why do you think you were the guy who got set up for the fall?
Well, for a number of years, I thought I was hit by an unlucky lightning bolt. And as time has passed and as pieces of data have floated to the surface, I believe that the reason that I was singled out for this prosecution, or at least set up for this prosecution, was because at the time I didn't know that Larry Sonsini was on the advisory board of the SEC. And if you recall, Ben and Marc, back in that time period, there were articles that were starting to hit about the quote unquote lucky CEOs, and how was it possible that these CEOs were able to grant stock options to themselves and or receive stock option grants at the low of the year.
Mm-hmm.
And what I believe happened was that Sonsini knew this was a hot button issue for the regulators. I think that he saw an opportunity to kind of carve me out. I think he also knew that Wilson Sonsini represented the majority of the A-grade firms in Silicon Valley. And, you know, they knew that this was a common practice. And I have subsequently come to learn from multiple sources that he may have in fact cut a deal with the feds to serve me up. And what was odd about this is that, you know, the company I built wouldn't help me defend myself. Everything was marked attorney-client privilege. There was a internal investigation, and it concluded that I had done nothing wrong and that there was no finding of wrongdoing. So, you know, all I can believe is that, you know, the guy that can see around corners or can see around the curvature of the earth and knows what's coming really did a masterful job of kind of carving me out and you know, pushing me on a slab of ice.
Wow, it's just like what a wild and insane way, you know, to get pinned down. And then there were a couple of other things about it that really struck me. One is you didn't make any money on backdating. Like it wasn't as though it went into your pocket. Yeah.
Well, let's flush it out in its technicolor. So I had been very, very successful economically by being at Brocade prior to going public. And the process that sent me to prison was one where we were trying to come up with a fair way of granting stock options to our employees. I was never accused of backdating my own stock options. I was never accused of making a penny from my conduct. And I think that the crazy making of it all was that it didn't even involve cash. It was hypothetical non-cash that had to do with the grant date and the share price. And at the end of the day, the stock options that were involved, the majority of them were never even exercised by employees. It was much ado about nothing.
And as I understand it, that the accounting rule, which you were found to have violated, is no longer a rule.
Well, the accounting rule that I was criminally prosecuted for was called APB. I think it was APB 27. I'd never heard of it before, but it was a ruling about the measurement date and the grant date associated with granting employee stock options and the amount of a non-cash charge that should be reported. And in fact, when I was prosecuted, that particular accounting pronouncement was null and void. It wasn't in effect. It wasn't being used anymore. So it was kind of like if you can imagine going back in time and criminally prosecuting somebody for a now defunct law, it just made my head want to explode.
Wow. And so now, now at this point, the walls start closing in because you've resigned, and so now you lose kind of the company protections, you know, whatever they were doing, and so kind of what happened next with the prosecutors, and then how was that affecting your personal life? Because you had an amazing family, you were, you know, you made $1 billion, you own like the Sharks. I mean, like you were like such a big figure in Silicon Valley. What happened through that prosecution process?
Well, I was one of these guys that, in many ways, and probably wrongfully so, I viewed, my team and many of my employees as almost like an extended family. I mean, I spent more time working with them than I did with my own family, just because of travel requirements and the demands of the job. So the minute that I was asked to resign, I was basically ostracized, and people just went dark on me. So that was very disorienting. You kind of lose your sense of equilibrium when one day a switch is flipped and the atmospherics have changed. So it was disorienting personally. It was a horrible ordeal for my family. I had 2 young children at the time, and once I was criminally indicted, then all the oxygen came out of the room, and the pressure was almost unbearable because now you're in a fight for your life. And one of the ways that I described it is, if you think things are bad, they can always get a lot worse. Like I thought, oh my God, I mean, I could never imagine being fired. I've never been fired. Well, then that happens. And then, my God, I mean, I can't, this is so ridiculous. I can't imagine, the SEC pursuing this. This is absurd. And then I get a Wells notice. And then, oh my God, I mean, I can't imagine not being a public company CEO again. And then, I'm criminally indicted. And then it's like, oh my God, I'm going to trial. And, these charges amount to, 20 plus years per count. And, this could be, the end of my life as I knew it. So yeah, it was debilitating.
Man, yeah, that is. And so, under that, you're walking into this trial, and then there were some like real surprises about what people were saying on the stand in the first trial that turned out to not even be true, that they admitted weren't true. And what was that like?
Well, let me start at the beginning of the process for people who don't know how a criminal trial unfolds. It starts with something called the voir dire process, where you show up before the trial is supposed to start, and the courtroom is packed with prospective jurors, and they fill out a questionnaire, a voir dire questionnaire, to vet them. And there's like a draft pick where we can knock out, and I'm just going from memory, so I'm probably wrong. We can knock out 10 jurors that we think are biased, and the prosecution can knock out 10. Well, we get into the list, and I'm reading what these people are writing, and I'm reading things like, this guy's a CEO. I don't even need to know the facts. I think all CEOs should go to prison for the rest of their lives. And I'm thinking, holy cow, this is not like it's supposed to be. This is not like television. And, my attorney would say, Your Honor, we think, Mr. Smith should be disqualified for bias. And the judge would say, Mr. Smith, I'd like to ask you a question. If I asked you to be fair and impartial for Mr. Reyes, even though it says here that you think he's guilty, would you do that for me? Yes, Your Honor. Okay, you can stay in the jury pool. So that was kind of the base level atmospheric, right? And it's like, okay, I can kind of get a sense as to how this is going to go. Well, in the first trial, the entire premise of the prosecution was that I had somehow deceived Mike Bird about how stock options were granted to employees, and that caused Brocade to improperly account for hypothetical non-cash expenses under APB 25. Now, the long and the short of it is that was a lie. They knew it was a lie.
Well, and you had actually been guilty of the opposite, right? Of over delegating, not kind of running your own program behind the CFO's back, but actually giving the whole thing to the CFO.
Oh, 100%, 100%. And if he'd said, "Hey, Greg, this is how we should account for it," I would say, "Okay. I mean, if that's how we should account for it, let's account for it that way." So the other kind of crazy making is there were all of these employees, some of which I'd never met before. Some were laid off in reductions in force. Others had gotten passed over for promotions that the feds had found. And none of them had really interacted with me, but they kind of painted this company that I love that was built on meritocracy. And, we did all kinds of EQ 360 questionnaires to make sure that all of our executives were tuned in at all levels. Like this one woman, she said, the prosecution witness saying, "What did you hear Mr. Reyes say?" And she said, "I heard him say, it's not illegal if you don't get caught." Now, this had never been in any of her prior interviews with the FBI. I mean, she clearly made it up. I mean, maybe if I did say that, I probably said it in the context of a Raiders game where there was a bad call and somebody didn't get, but it was that kind of crazy making.
Yeah. That is just unbelievable. And so then how did you went through the trial and then you had an appeal and you won the appeal?
Well, yeah, I did. And I'm going to just rewind a little bit. What's ironic about it is the day after I was found guilty, the SEC then came out and charged Mike Bird with securities fraud after the feds had argued that I had somehow deceived him. So, we went in then to the judge saying, "Hey, you need to throw out the verdict because this is just bogus." Of course, he wouldn't do that because he was so having my scalp on his lodge pole. But in any event, people started to come forward. We had a witness that the prosecutor had basically composed testimony out of, and she lied, and she came forward even under threat of perjury and admitted that she had lied. And we went back to the same judge. He still wouldn't throw out the verdict. And then, make a long story short, a year plus later, another $1 million in legal fees, I won on appeal. I had a brilliant appellate attorney named Seth Waxman who did a phenomenal job of arguing that case. And I thought it was over.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, I mean, I've never heard of anybody being tried twice for the same crime.
Oh, it happened. It happens all the time. It happens all the time. So instead of finding for me and throwing the case out, the Ninth Circuit Appellate Court threw the case out and left it to the U.S. Attorney's discretion as to whether or not they retried me, which they did.
Yeah. And then on the second time, they convicted you.
They did, except this time it was a truly brilliant, indefensible prosecution. And the prosecution was very tight, it was very discreet, it was very simple, and it went something like this: that the U.S. government, hired someone from an accounting firm to go through all of Greg Reyes's personal stock option grants that I received, which, by the way, I didn't grant to myself. Yeah. And because there was no way to determine the grant date of those options to Mr. Reyes, it would have resulted in a $300 million hypothetical non-cash expense, even though Mr. Reyes never exercised any of those options. So they implied that I had received backdated stock options from my board of directors, but the members of my board from the compensation committee wouldn't come and testify on my behalf because they were under threat of criminal prosecution. And then I don't know if this is still around, but there was this group called ISS, and they would,
they're still around.
they're still around, and they would like create make work to, determine, your compliance level. And they rolled out this ISS lady who said that I'd been so grossly overcompensated, and, based on the performance of the company, I was, massively overpaid. And then they found a guy who was an ex-New York fireman. They had to advertise in the Wall Street Journal to find any witnesses, but they found a guy who was an FNDY fireman who owned some Brocade shares, started selling like 10 shares before the restatement and sold another 10 after, who came out in his fireman costume and, said that it would have mattered, hypothetical non-cash expenses would have mattered to him because, it was an important fact. Even though he'd never read a financial statement, it didn't even know what they were. So they dirtied me. They like soiled my reputation by making it look like I was some greedy, self-dealing, unfair CEO who, damaged firemen.
Right. Even though your compensation wasn't determined by you, it's determined by the board of directors who didn't show up.
Yeah,
that's
100%.
Yeah,
100%.
That's really something. Before we get into, let me just pause for a second and see, Marc, do you have, we've been talking a lot. I want to make sure I let you get in before we get into jail and all these things.
No, I think we have good momentum. This has been great. By the way, Greg, we're getting a ton of positive feedback on this, from all the people listening. So let's keep going.
Okay. All right. So, okay. So they get you, and now you've got you're going from being CEO of Brocade to whatever number you were going into prison.
Yeah, man, it was a long fall, right? So this started in 2005. Now we're at 2010, $15 million fine. Even though I didn't accuse him not making a penny for my supposed crimes, no shareholder lost a penny. I'm at like 50 million in legal fees. I'm getting divorced, going through a divorce. I'm kind of at like rock bottom. And I'm going to Taft Correctional Institution in Taft, California. And that's where I serve my term.
Wow. And great. Actually, I do have a question. How did you, or what did you do to prepare?
So that's actually a great question. So I thought about, what it was going to be like, and I thought about, how I could prepare myself. So I knew that I needed to have a power of attorney for my accountant to sign on my behalf and to pay my bills and to sign my taxes for me. I gave my mom a book list and asked her to send me a book a week. I came up with a list of friends and asked them if they would come and visit me. And I had somebody who would put money on my books so I would be able to eat and buy shoes. And you get free stuff when you go to prison, but it's not stuff you'd want to eat or wear or drinks. So I did as much research as I could to prepare myself for the inevitable.
And then, but when you got there, the day you arrived, they put you in solitary.
Yeah, they call it the hole.
Yes.
So I show up, right, and I'm a friend of mine drove me down there, and I'm crying, and it's just like, oh my God, I mean, I can't believe this is happening to me. And I get there, and they're like, oh, who are you? I said, I'm Greg Reyes. And they stuck me in a cell, and they said, hey man, your paperwork didn't show up, so you're gonna have to be in solitary confinement until it does. And I'm like, are you kidding me? So they're like, no. So they took me to the hole, which is this solitary confinement, and it's like something out of a horror movie where like human beings are like kept in these tiny little windowless cells, and you're like hearing people screaming and crying and pounding on the walls, and I'm thinking this is not for me. This is not a good start.
Yeah, yeah, that is. And how long did they leave you in solitary before they found your paperwork?
I think it was like 24 hours or 48
Right.
hours. And then they released me into the general population.
Yeah. And what was that time like? Because, you know, you wrote a book while you were in prison. You did a lot of things. You definitely used your time.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, my view of how to be successful at anything is you need to have a vision. You need to decompose it into a plan that if you execute the plan, you will achieve your desired outcome, and you need to hold yourself accountable. So, you know, I knew that I needed to find my way, and I didn't know how I was going to do that, and I was scared to death. But within an hour of walking in to my cell block, this guy comes up to me and goes, "Hey, are you Greg Reyes?" I said, "Yeah, I am. Who are you?" He goes, "I'm Michael Santos. I've been waiting for you." I'm like, "Michael Santos?" He's like, "Hey,
Yeah.
this is going to be great." I'm like, "Oh, it's going to be great." It's like, "No, this is going to be great. You know, you're going to make the best of this. You know, I'm here to help you get through this." And you know, he was like my mentor there. And you know, I dropped like
Oh, wow.
100 pounds, and I ran a couple marathons, and I wrote a book, and I read 70 books, and you know, played chess at night to keep my brain fresh. And you know, I really came out of there strong, and you know, that's what Michael advocated for in prison, and you know, that's what he's advocated for since he got out. And an amazing guy, you know, that basically, you know, got multiple degrees in prison and wrote best-selling books,
Yeah.
and set incredible goals for himself.
And who was Michael Santos? Like, what was he in for?
Michael is an interesting case, and the way he'll tell the story is that he's a Cuban guy. I'm half Cuban. He grew up in either Seattle or Washington, I can't remember, but his dad had a construction company, and it was right about the time that Scarface was a popular movie. And you know, he'd go to the clubs, and you know, you see these guys with these really good-looking women, and he said to his buddies, like how does that guy end up with this girl? He's like, "Oh, he's a drug dealer." He's like, "Drug dealer? What's that?" And he said, "Look, you buy a kilo of cocaine for $5,000, you sell it for 15, and you give it to the chicks, and they think you're really amazing." He's like, "Shit, I can do that." So he basically ended up using his dad's line of credit, and he ended up getting like 50 years to life back when the federal system, in fact, had parole. So he was kind of the Scarface poster boy. And you know, Michael managed to turn himself into an amazing human being through that process.
Yeah, no, that is remarkable. And yeah, no, it's really interesting because you know, you had or made a lot of relationships in prison that you know, is interesting. I remember in reading the book, which isn't out yet, by the way, but Greg's working on that. That, you know, some of those guys ended up being like a lot easier to deal with than you know, your employees who you worked with on the outside at the end.
Well, I mean, look, I think that without naming names beyond Bird,
Yes.
I think that the best way that I can describe it, that given a constant state of atmospherics, you can develop a high degree of confidence on as it relates to how somebody's going to behave, what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are, how they're going to react in certain situations. What I came to learn through this process is that you know, once the feds show up and they start, you know, implying that they're going to drag somebody, some white collar guy, you know, out of his house and send him to prison, their character gets revealed very quickly.
Yes.
And there were, I mean, look, in the prison population, there are a lot of people that are there for good reason.
Mhm.
And there are some that are there because of the circumstances of their lives, which is very sad. And there are a handful of guys that shouldn't be there at all. But
Yeah.
the one thing that I found in the prison environment is it's it's pretty raw. People kind of are what they are. There's not this eminence front, if you will. I don't know if you guys remember the
Mhm.
eminence front song that the Who came out with in the 80s. Eminence
Yeah.
front. It's a put on. There was a lot of that going on back in my day, and I'm sure there's a lot of it going on now. But in prison, people, everybody's got their rap and their hustle, but people are pretty real. They're not trying to pretend that they're somebody that they're not.
Right. Right.
Did
Right.
I did I answer your question?
Yeah. No, that was super super helpful. And when you get so kind of of coming out of prison, you then your old life is gone. So what then?
Ugh, that was actually the hardest part. I drifted. I mean, I kind of went from a guy who was busy from 7 in the morning until 9 o'clock at night, uh, 6, sometimes 7 days a week. People lined up outside my office. I was kind of a full contact CEO, and I went from that to the phone's not ringing,
Yeah.
and living your life in Silicon Valley and people kind of shooting you looks like, hey, is that guy? And it was hard. It was disorienting. It was horrible, and I had to reinvent myself.
Hey, Greg.
I yes.
Yeah, if you don't mind, there's actually a step I think that we skipped that I think is important for understanding the system. If you're willing to discuss it, which would be the halfway house.
Oh no.
Is that okay? I mean, I'm totally talking, but
So, no, I'm happy
I
to.
remember your Facebook posts from the time, so that's why I'm suggesting it.
So the halfway house was almost worse than the prison. So there's kind of a a process that isn't well understood where at the end of your sentence, and I can't remember the calculation, you're entitled to get some amount of time in a halfway house, which is supposed to assist you in transitioning back into society. And the halfway house that I went to was in the Tenderloin, which is a rough part of San Francisco. And show up, and you're basically now a prisoner in an apartment building, and you have to perform tasks. Like, you have to show that you can go out and set up a bank account. You have to go and find a job, and you have to pay the halfway house some percentage of the money you get for your job. And as you're doing that, you're, you know, stepping over human feces and people who've like OD'd on the side of the street, and it's probably like the worst environment that any human being could be thrust into that's trying to re-enter society. So I did that. I did that for uh, 2 months, and I was again through Michael Santos. He helped introduce me to a fellow that he'd met in prison who owned a big lumber company who I think did a year or two because of some tax related issue. Another bad CFO that caused that parade of horribles to happen to him. But he gave me a job. I was like working in the accounting department of a lumber company in South San Francisco. But but for him and Michael, I wouldn't have gotten through the process. And by the way, the process is structured ever escape. Like, the process is structured so that if you do anything after you're convicted before you go to prison, something bad happens to you, or if you're in the halfway house and you don't show up on time, or they show up to your workplace and they can't find you, or you can't get a job, then you go back to prison. And then after you're out of the halfway house, you're on parole, and if anything happens to you, you end up back in prison. So the answer is end up back in prison, almost irrespective of where you are in that sausage making process.
Yeah, that is crazy. And but then there was also, once you get out of the halfway house, you're kind of restricted. I mean, one of the things I remember back, when when you got out and we were talking was, you couldn't go, like you had a felony. You can't go on public boards. You can't. There are so many things that are just restricted. Tell us about that.
Oh, then it's it's horrible. The felon stigma is horrible, and I want to make it clear. And this is something that one of my best friends told me, Marc, at a moment when I was feeling down. And Marc's a very well-known, famous investor and short seller, and he said that it's not what they call you, it's what you answer to. So like I thought, man, I mean, I'm out and this is over. But
Yeah.
the stigma is pervasive, right? So company CEO was the worst of my problems. Bank of America fired me. I had, like, for 20 years done business with Bank of America, and I get a letter one day saying I've got 30 days to clear out my accounts, and I could not find another bank to bank with me because I was a felon.
Wow.
And the parade of horribles continues. That, like, once you're a felon, if somebody wants to ruin your life, put a spent shell casing under your seat, and then call the cops and say, oh, so and so's a felon. They've got a spent shell casing or a round of ammunition. It's mandatory 5 to 10 years. So you live in constant fear. You
Wow.
live in constant fear. So you get out of prison. And this isn't just Greg Reyes. I think this is just to people in general who come out of the back end of the sausage making process. You're completely traumatized. You've got a stigma. You have virtually no opportunity to livelihood. And then if somebody is smart, they can send you back for another 5 to 10 years. Stick a bullet in your car. If you and I happen to be driving and you happen to have a legal firearm in your possession, and we get pulled over and the cops find that out, I go back to prison for constructive possession as a felon, even when I'm not on parole. That, by the way, is why I sued the federal government to get my Second Amendment rights back, and I won well before the pardon. But it's just crazy what they do to people. It's horrible.
Wow. Wow. And this is, I mean, the thing that's so stunning is it's after you've served your time. I mean, it's not as if that you didn't go to prison. You served your time, and then you're stamped with that scarlet letter and always on the edge. Terrible.
Oh, it's the gift that keeps on giving, guys. I mean, the only thing that saved me, quite frankly, was meeting my second wife. I was drifting, lost, very unhappy, and then I met my wife and got my equilibrium back and found a purpose, and been happily married now 6 years as of just a couple weeks ago. And if it wasn't for my wife, I don't know where I would be, quite frankly. I'd probably be living in a bottle or continuing to fight the demons. I mean, she would tell me up until just about 3 years ago that almost every night, a couple nights a week, I would wake up screaming in my sleep because I had this reoccurring nightmare of feds kicking down my door and guys with, like, black Kevlar helmets dragging me out of my bed. I mean, this is real stuff.
Greg, how did you meet your wife?
So when I got out, I lived in Santa Cruz, and that kind of kept me out of Silicon Valley. And I, thought I'd be close enough to see my kids regularly, even though that never materialized. And I was in my house, and I was just really, like, I didn't want to socialize with anybody. And a friend of mine said, hey, let's go to this beach barbecue at the Crow's Nest. And I'm like, no, I don't want to go, man. Well, he came and got me, as good friends do. And we went to this thing, and I had a couple beers and a hamburger and met my wife, and the rest is history. It was just was it the hand of God? What was it, a chance encounter? Maybe it was both, but it was a true blessing for me. And now we've got a 2-year-old baby daughter, and life has never been better for Greg Reyes.
So my wife would kill me if I don't ask this question, so I have to, which is like, how did you, what did you tell her, like that first night when you're talking to her?
Oh, it's funny, Mark. So the answer is, I wouldn't give her my full name. I just told her I was Greg. And we actually went out on a couple of dates, and she said, this is really getting weird. You're creeping me out. And I just said, I just want you to get to know me for me. And I got a call at like 4 a.m. and she said, I figured out who you are. Like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. And I was like, phew, because I was afraid. I have this stigma, and still today, if you Google Greg Reyes, this is like top 10 business criminals of all time. I mean, it's like, really? It's crazy.
Yeah. That's so crazy. I mean, because there are some real actual business criminals out there. So it is, that is just bananas. So talk about the process to getting pardoned, because I know you had been working on that. It has to be at least 7 or 8 years.
Well, so it's actually one of my proudest and most rewarding achievements to have received a pardon from President Trump. And the reason it is because I believe that it was 100% based on merit. And I'll tell you the story. After my first conviction, I had attempted to get a pardon before my appeal. And this was before I won my appeal, and this was with President Bush. And it was unsuccessful. And if you go back and do the work, he basically didn't pardon anybody. And then I didn't even try during the Obama era, because I just, I'm not connected with the Democratic Party, and I didn't know anybody. And then President Trump gets elected, and my wife said, Greg, I really think you can get a pardon. I think he's a businessman. I think he would understand what happened to you. I said, you know what? I don't know. I wanted to just put it behind me and get on with my life. And, I spent a lot of money trying to get a pardon before, like $600,000, and had nothing to show for it. And it was just too painful. Well, she was encouraging me, and I just started calling around and saying, hey, do you know President Trump? And, got a lot of hang-ups in Silicon Valley. And about 2 years ago, a very good friend of mine, one of my best friends, who is vice president of a technology company, said, my friend is really good friends with the president, and let's see if we can get him signed up to advocate for you. So we had a conference call, and I told him my story, and I sent him my information, and he didn't hear from him for a month or two, and he called me back, and he called me back and said, hey, Greg, I'm playing golf with the president, and I'm gonna tell him about you.
Oh, wow.
So my wife and I, now granted, this is like 2 years ago. We're waiting around, how did it go? What happened? And he calls me, he says, you're not going to believe it. I was partnered with the president. I played 18 holes with him. I told him your whole story, and he thought it sounded horrible, and he said that he would have somebody look into it. Complete radio silence for a year and a half. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, there's no chance at this. I'm not even going to try anymore. And then I'm talking to my friend Michael Santos, and he goes, Greg, you need to try to get a pardon. And I'm like, I don't even know where to begin, Michael. He said, you need to contact my friend Sean Hopwood. Sean Hopwood is a great guy. He might be able to help you. But at the end of the day, Greg, I think it'd be crazy not to call Sean. So he introduces me to Sean Hopwood. Turns out Sean Hopwood is one of the most amazing men that I've ever met. He was a bank robber. He robbed
Wow.
five banks, went to prison. He was, I guess you would call him a jailhouse lawyer who won Supreme Court cases
Out of, in prison, from
uh,
prison?
in in prison.
Wow.
He got out, got his law degree, and he's now a professor at Georgetown, and
Oh my God.
and has done just amazing things. And it also turns out he was one of the authors and very actively involved in getting President Trump's First Step Act
Yeah.
approved, which is, I think, probably the only bipartisan piece of legislation that came out of the Trump presidency. So
Yeah.
I call Sean, I tell him my story. He's like, well, I don't know, man. I got to get to know you. And I said, okay, where do I meet you? And he said, well, I'm going to be in Cleveland, Ohio, 2 weekends from now.
That's a good test. You willing to go to Cleveland?
So I drag my wife and our infant to Cleveland, Ohio, and I meet with Sean.
Yeah.
And we met for like 4 hours. Well, make a long story short, the person who argued, I said, Sean, how did you win these Supreme Court cases in prison? He goes, oh, well, I found somebody to advocate for me. And his name is Seth Waxman. I said, Seth Waxman, my appellate attorney was Seth Waxman. So we had common ground. And
Yeah.
I kind of went into, Greg Reyes sales mode. And I thought, I'm really going to advocate hard with Sean. And, I told him my story, and I mean, literally we spent 4 hours talking about me and talking about him and his family. And, and then Sean called me and said, okay, I'll work with you. And I
Yeah.
really think that you've got a shot. So time is progressing, and Sean, are you hearing anything? It's like, no, they keep saying that they're going to do pardon reform. We just
Yeah.
need to be patient for the right time. Well, then there was a series of events, right? You had the whole impeachment thing, and you had, the
Yes.
end of the Mueller thing, and so it was kind of careening from one crisis to another. We get to the December timeframe, and Sean says, "Look, Greg, I think that we need to bring somebody else on the team. We need to bring Brett Tolman." Well, Brett is an ex federal prosecutor, very involved in prison reform. He's on Fox News a lot and CNN a lot, and introduced me to Brett. And Brett said, "I think there's a lot of merit to what happened to you. It's just, I can't believe you got prosecuted." And Brett sought to get other federal prosecutors to sign on to a letter recommending that I receive a pardon. And the more I interacted with Brett and Sean, the more passionate that they got about me and my situation. And we're getting close to the transition to the Biden presidency, and about a week before the craziness in Washington, I thought, I really need to go into sales mode. So I
Yeah.
called the individual that had played golf with President Trump, asked him to advocate again. I'm watching Maria Bartiromo on Fox, and I thought, oh, I know Maria, and she talks to the president all the time. So I got her email address. I emailed her. She called me right back. We spent like an hour on the phone. She said, next time I talk to the president, I'll absolutely, tell him that I think what happened to you was horrific, and never should have happened. And I was like staggered that somebody I hadn't spoken to in 20 years was willing to help. I called a guy named David Horowitz, who happens to be the dad of a friend of mine who has some connections, and said, Mr. Horowitz, would you please call anybody that you know? So I just started calling everybody that I knew that might know somebody that could say something about Greg Reyes on my behalf. So, then we had the situation in the Capitol and the riots or insurrection or whatever you choose to call it. And
Yeah.
Sean calls me and he says, Greg, I don't see how this is going to happen at all for you. I don't see it happening for anybody. quite
Yeah.
frankly. And so then I'm like, oh my God. And make a long story short, I don't know exactly the dynamics of how it happened. But I believe that Brett and Sean continued to advocate for me and figured out what the process was, as ad hoc as it may have been. And the only feedback that I got was that the people that they talked to thought that I was very deserving and should never have been criminally prosecuted. So for me,
Yeah.
like it doesn't really change anything, but it also changes everything. I mean, I can say with 100% confidence that I know that I got a presidential pardon because the people that vetted the petitioners thought that I got a raw deal, and that means something.
Oh yeah,
I
yeah.
didn't.
No, it's finally lets you close the chapter. I mean, it's so remarkable in just talking, just your whole uh, demeanor and spirit now compared to the last time we did a talk like this. It's just such a transformation, and I can tell you finally were able to walk away from that.
The demons are back in the bottle, Ben.
Yeah, yeah. No, it is great to see. Um, so we have some great questions from the audience and from Twitter, but I realize that we've got somebody here who asked one of those great questions. So if you don't mind, Greg, I was going to bring him up to speak. He's a friend of mine who served 19 years in prison and 7 in solitary confinement. I've talked to you about him before. His name is Shaka. And if you don't mind, I'll bring him up. Oh, you read his book?
I read his book. I'd love to meet him.
Oh, perfect. Okay, here he is. Shaka, what's up?
Hey, what's going on, Ben? This conversation has been amazing. And Greg, I'm happy the demons are back in the bottle. It's just so refreshing to hear your perspective and your experience and just all the things you've learned through the process that you're sharing. So super just honored to get a chance to meet with you and talk. The one question I had was, why do you, in your opinion, do you think a pardon is important at this stage of just your life and your transition back? And how can governments, whether it's local governments or national, use these more effectively to help people transition back home?
Oh, Shaka, I think it's a great question. I guess the thing that I learned from my vantage point is that there really is no process. That today, and it's been this way for decades, the pardon attorney lives in the Justice Department. And why would anybody think that office has any incentive to grant clemency, a pardon, or reduce a sentence, as unjust as it may be, living in the entity that sent that individual to prison? So the first thing is, I think the system is incredibly broken. And because it's broken, you tend to get this flurry at the end of a president's term where people are doing everything that they know how to do to try to get clemency. And I think the tragedy in this is that there are thousands and thousands of people that are serving time in prison because of ridiculous sentencing guidelines for things that today wouldn't even be considered a crime, to victims of criminal prosecution for things that should never have been prosecuted criminally. So, for me personally, I wanted to win. I wanted to prevail in an unjust system and what I believe to be an unjust prosecution. And I think there are thousands, maybe tens of thousands of deserving people who've transformed their lives, from you to Sean Hopwood, to Michael Santos, to people that are basically buried alive, doing 20-year plus sentences as young men because of these ridiculous sentencing guidelines. So I would love to see somebody have the courage to step up and and come up with a process that isn't dominated by politics and just do the right thing for human beings.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you for reading the book. I'm really excited. I'm actually going to put in for my pardon finally this year, and hope everything goes well. So appreciate you being out here beating the drum for justice.
No, I wish you the best, Jacques, and I look forward to meeting you. I think you're an example of somebody who has done wonderful things with a difficult deck you were dealt.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're gonna make that happen for sure. As soon as we just got to let a few more of these vaccines get out there, and we're definitely going to put that together. Marc, what do you got?
Well, so I have a great closing question. Should I ask it now, or should I wait till the end?
Well, if it's great, then ask it now, and we can get into it.
Yeah. So Greg, so if this were a movie, the final scene would be, probably you with your lovely wife and your kid, or maybe in the future, grandkids, and on the porch looking out at the sunset, and there'd be some voiceover, to the effect of redemption, and then, sort of all the lessons you learned along the way, and how you, had learned to let it go, and, not look back in anger. And you always wonder when you watch those movie scenes, it's like, okay, is that really how I would be? Because it doesn't feel like how I would be. It feels like I would still be really upset. And so I'm just really curious, when you look back, how do you feel?
I feel a lot of things at different times, but I guess I feel very grateful for the people that are in my life and have helped me get through this amazing journey that I've been on. I obviously thank God for my wife, and I've learned a lot about myself. I mean, I'd like to think that when I reflect, I can say to the man looking back at me in the mirror, I'm a winner. This didn't define me. I always find a way to win, and I always find a way to come out on top. And I didn't let it bury me. I didn't let it cripple me. I didn't let it ruin my life. In a very twisted kind of way, I could thank that judge and prosecutor for this, because I've got an amazing wife and a beautiful child that I never would have had, and I've got a whole new set of friends that are made of real metal instead of just soft tissue.
Yeah. And then
Yeah,
maybe,
that's
maybe I
amazing.
could ask. Yeah, maybe I could ask one more, which is, how many people who you met when you were in prison? How many do you still talk to?
I would say maybe 3 or 4. It's people's lives just go in different directions. You know how that goes.
Yeah. Yeah.
He sounds a little like you, Shaka, in terms of perspective. At the
Yeah.
end, that was a really interesting summary, of just understanding how life works and who you are.
Yeah. I appreciate it, Ben, and I'm vaccinated, so we can meet soon.
Yeah, let's go.
I look forward to it.
Yeah, no, definitely we will get that together. Greg, so now what? So what are you? We work with so many kind of young CEOs who, could greatly use kind of advice in your experience. Not, in terms of leading an organization. Having a vision, setting the goals, organizing the company around them. And now you also have a whole nother layer, which is governance and how that works, and how to protect yourself. So what are your plans now? You are completely clean from a felony standpoint and everything. And how are you thinking about the next 10 years?
Well, that's a good question, Ben. I think that I want to help people. I want to help young leaders. They don't necessarily have to be business executives. And I think I've got a toolkit that can help people accelerate their path to success, and avoid making mistakes that aren't necessarily obvious. I mean, now I've got a new repertoire in my toolkit, which has to do with compliance and governance. So, I I kind of have the scarlet letter, but I think I bring a lot of horsepower to any board, whether it's a public company board or a private board or, even investment fund.
Yeah. Well, no, that scarlet letter's gone. It got erased.
It is what scarlet letter?
Yeah, exactly. It's so, yeah, man, it's just so exciting to know that. So let's talk a little, kind of at the end here about like, now that you're viewing the world with fresh eyes and kind of business and all these things that are going on. What do you see? What do you see with businesses today? What do you think is kind of better than in well, I'll call it our era, when we were CEO, and as opposed to now, and what's maybe gotten worse?
Well, that's a great question. I actually thought about that quite a bit before our call, and when we were operators, things were pretty discreet. It was pretty one-dimensional, right? It was about gaining customers, taking market share, building a profitable business, org structure, pay for performance. Well, now, you've got this whole issue of environmental concerns, social concerns, governance concerns, and at one level, ESG can be a buzzword. At another level, it can be incredibly impactful. And I think to be a successful CEO in today's age, you got to be pretty darn good at three-dimensional chess. I mean, it's not one-dimensional. It's not monochromatic. It's technicolor. It's moving fast. The gremlins are out there, and you need to really have a discrete strategy that's multidimensional.
And how do you kind of balance that with, it's hard to build a company. It's hard to like get customers and make the product work and beat the competition and all these things. And how do you, how do you think about, like, how would you think about like making those things a priority, or how you would deal with, workforce that might have their own ideas about the company mission that's different than your own vision?
Well, I think at the end of the day, the job of a great leader isn't to have his or her vision and do a cram down. It's crafting a vision that is inclusive of other opinions and shaping it and molding it and melding it so that you can spit out a strategy that's actionable and that people can be held accountable, while at the same time, having a lens for environmental issues, like not happy words, but, how can we make sure that we're leaving the planet better than we left it? The social issues, which are kind of front and center in our day and age today, being thoughtful and how to make sure that we're supporting, those stakeholders. And then making sure from a governance standpoint, I mean, you and I've talked about this privately. I think we're living in the golden age of fraud. I mean, we're seeing CEOs do things without mentioning any names that like are incredible, like making claims that are clearly on their face fraudulent and promotional, and trading and taking a position and tweeting about it. And at some point that pendulum's going to snap back, and you don't want to be on the wrong side of that snapback. I think there's an opportunity, experienced hands to add value at all levels.
No, I agree with that. It is really interesting. And one of the things that I worry about is, you do see people, I would just say, take liberties with the SEC rules, particularly on Twitter. And then, I worry all the time about, okay, now you've got, a younger CEO coming up, looking at that, who may not have the celebrity or the protection to get away with the same thing, and still does it, and then finds themselves in jail.
So it's 100%. I think that's that's a real issue. I mean, we're going to see I predict we're going to see a very harsh snapback. And if people don't get used to cutting, 90-degree, right and left hand turns, you're going to get broadsided. And there's no reason for it, because you don't have to speed. You can be successful going the speed limit.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the other things on that I found very interesting, having kind of been, a public company CEO, is the market, the governance or the regulatory market is bifurcated in this very weird way, where you've got multi-billion-dollar private companies that, they never, they generally, other than some really outrageous cases, are never kind of sued by their investors or prosecuted or anything. And then you've got the public markets, which, if you look at somebody wrong, you're getting sued by shareholders, and you'll get prosecuted very, very quickly. And I wonder, because the laws aren't that different, it's just the enforcement is different. And it's a very interesting societal thing in general, which is, and you've kind of alluded to it, where we have a set of laws, but they don't apply to everybody. And that's getting kind of true in corporate law. It's always we've always kind of known about it on like things like drugs. Like, if Michael Santos, wasn't from Cuba and in the neighborhood he was, he might not have gone to prison at all, just because, drug laws are applied to certain neighborhoods at certain times. And then it seems that, enforcement is applied in the public markets, but not in the private markets. And so it's just a very interesting, weird situation, I think, with law enforcement.
Well, I mean, not to rattle the cage of the beast, but I mean, where's the SEC been? Where's the SEC been for the last 4 years? I mean, when a CEO publicly says that the SEC stands for suck so-and-so, you know what? I mean, and nothing happens. Like, what message does that send? It's like we can do whatever the hell we want, and so can everybody else. It's crazy to me.
Yeah, it is definitely uneven. Just truly interesting.
Well, and that's why, Ben, I think that the good hygiene and best practices are important, because it is asymmetrical, it is random, and if people aren't careful, they're going to be in a world of hurt, and they don't have to be.
Yeah, that's such a good point, because in securities laws, one thing that people, I think most people don't realize is, in the whole history of stock options, up till the great stock option kind of accounting scandal, nobody was ever prosecuted for anything they did. Like, there was never, like, it was hard to imagine it being a crime because it was never a crime. Like, if you were a public CEO at the time, you'd be like, okay, well, how's revenue recognition? Because I know people go to jail for that. What kind of fraud are there? And if you looked at the entire set of cases, nobody had ever been prosecuted for that crime. And the thing that triggered it was literally, like, there was two things: the dot-com crash, where people lost a lot of money, and then a paper, I think out of Princeton, just kind of noticing the pattern of when, the price of stock options when they were issued. And that triggered the toll enforcement action. So it's really interesting. There are laws around accounting that's enforced when is very arbitrary.
Oh, 100%. I can remember the article well. It was called The Lucky CEOs. And I remember reading it thinking, holy cow, like, I can't even imagine people doing that. And then I'm the one guy who gets criminally prosecuted and didn't even grant himself his own stock options. It's crazy.
Yeah,
so,
no, that's wild.
So I think my tale is a cautionary tale. And if you're a CEO listening or a board member, just be smart. It doesn't cost you anything to be smart.
Yeah, and talk briefly about that. Like, when you say be smart, kind of what are a couple of the things that are really obvious to you in retrospect that you didn't see nearly as clearly going through it the first time?
Well, like we talked about the committee of one, we talked about having your counsel on your board, but I think, having a compliance strategy and, having quiet periods and holding people accountable for making sure that, they're squeaky clean on RevRec, and making sure that, now we've got so much leakiness with social media, enforcing policies and practices so the company's not at risk, the shareholders aren't at risk, and the CEO and the board aren't at risk. Just be smart.
Yeah, social media is such an interesting one. It's one, we're at the firm, we're a registered investment advisor, an RIA. So we, kind of enforce a social media policy, but it's really interesting because we're a very rare, definitely entity that does that. It's generally a free-for-all out there, and people don't realize that all that stuff can be very dangerous if it relates to the business in any way. If you're going, oh, we had a great quarter, one of your employees says that can quickly end up being a crime.
In a heartbeat. All it takes is some young prosecutor trying to make their bones and say, if I take that guy down, I can be in, private practice as a defense attorney in Skadden Arps making 7 figures in 3 years. I mean, it's the real world. I mean, if you watch the show Billions, it's kind of how it works. It's
a good show. Amazing dialogue. Brian Koppelman.
Indeed. I'm kind of new to it because I had too much PTSD. I tried to watch it a couple times, and now I'm okay.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. All right, well, let's get some. We're up against the time. So, Shaka, Marc, do you have any final questions?
Sorry, coming off mute. Hey, Greg, this has been really tremendous. Yeah, we're at an hour and a half, so don't want to take up your entire night. But this has been just incredibly tremendous. And we, like I said, we've just been getting a steady, a flood of positive feedback, on the back channels through the whole thing. So there are a ton of people in the audience, who have, I think, really appreciated, you being willing to tell the full story and to be as raw and honest as you've been.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for believing in me and being my friend throughout this entire process. I truly appreciate it. And Shaka, it was great meeting you, and I look forward to meeting you in person.
All right, great. Well, thank you everybody for coming, and thank you Margaret and Felicia for helping us get the room started, and thank you Shaka for coming up and asking a great question, and welcome back, Greg. It's so great to have you back with us, out of the whole system and back in the game. So
thank you so much. Glad to be back.
Awesome. Okay. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night, folks.